On this edition of Independent Sources, the rumble in Chinatown. The future of one of the city's oldest ethnic enclaves hangs in the balance as advocates battle to maintain the neighborhood's affordability and identity.
Independent Sources, your window to the city's ethnic and immigrant communities. Here's your host, Garry Pierre-Pierre.
New York City's Chinatown was once touted for resisting the encroaching specter of gentrification, despite being ringed by some of the city's most expensive real estate. Over the last few years, that narrative has changed, and now a collection of neighborhood groups called the Chinatown Working Group finds itself embroiled in a battle with the Department of City Planning to maintain the area's affordability and identity. Joining me in studio to talk more about this effort are Wellington Chen, the executive director of the Chinatown Partnership. The organization sprung out of the need to rebuild the neighborhood after 9/11, and Iris Shen, an organizer at the Chinese Staff and Workers Association. Before we begin, I'd like to take a look at this piece focusing on CAV. The organization formerly known as the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence has been a big part of the effort to halt the gentrification of the neighborhood.
What Chinatown offers, as what any other immigrant enclave in New York or other places offers, is a community that speaks your language, a community where you can buy groceries for the things that you like to cook. Many of Chinatown's residents also work in Chinatown. 91% of people who live in this area walk to work. And a lot of folks are seniors, a lot of people have raised their children here. A lot of folks who live in Manhattan's Chinatown have been here for a long time. CAV was started in the 1980s and 1986, sort of in the aftermath of a wave of anti-Asian hate crimes and anti-Asian violence throughout the country. And in the past 30 years, as an organization, we've organized taxi drivers, domestic workers, and then so many folks who were street vendors in Chinatown also had similar experiences of forced evictions, of landlord harassment, negligence, and that sort of thing. So in about 2005, 2006, we started the Chinatown Tenants Union. And so the union's been around for about 10, 11 years now.
They start their lives and they try to pursue the American dream, but unfortunately, a lot of this country's policies are kind of founded on racism, which is why Chinatown's kind of formed to kind of protect yourself a little bit from that. It's kind of the tale of two cities, right? The rich are really rich and the poor are really poor. And unfortunately, the majority of the residents in Chinatown are poor. So they're working, they're struggling to make ends meet, and on top of that, their landlords are using construction, just like very subversive tactics to get them to leave. The taller a building is, the more speculation there is. Like somebody kind of is a trailblazer in that sense and builds the first mega tower, then that gives room for other developers to come in and want to build more towers and further gentrify the neighborhood. So what that looks like is like local mom and pop shops closing down, rent going up, the cost of living going up, food, just the whole gamut of primary and secondary displacement caused by gentrification. Between
2000 and 2010, Chinatown lost over 17% of its Chinese resident population, right? I think there are folks out there who think Chinatown is a holdout because this neighborhood has been so strong for so long, but there's a real threat there. And I think the last thing folks want is for this area to kind of be a ghost of itself, a place that people call Chinatown but doesn't have any more of a Chinese community or an Asian immigrant community here.
Wellington, I want to start with you because I was reading in New York Magazine, you had this wonderful quote I want to read. You said, "A neighborhood in transition is like a bus. The Germans got on and then they got off. The Jewish population, same thing. The Italians succeeded and moved to Howard Beach. Right. So if you view Chinatown fundamentally as a bus, there's nothing wrong with the current situation. The battle that we are fighting right now is, can we stay on a little bit longer? Now, that is a trickier riddle. no group so far has managed to hang on. So why have the Chinese managed to stay on this bus for so long?
Because we have a fantastic underlying infrastructure that's unlike any other Chinatown. By the way, that quote stems from, I think, from Bill Moyers about pursue the American dream, and the, how each successive group managed to able to improve their lives and move on. And we have, number one of the largest concentration of affordable housing. If you look at all the so-called gentrification map, they're mostly all along the perimeters of Chinatown. The core is still very resistant. Of the 5,000 units that one of our compliance officers did a survey, 4,200 are rent control or rent stabilized. And that means that they're in these very small tenement buildings. And then we have one of the largest stock of public housing. The NYCHA housing that's going to be there, the Confucius Tower that's not going to be moved, all of the surrounding this, there are many other complexes, the South Bridge, the Smith houses, the Knickerbockers. So what people, there's also two phenomena that has always been is that people always fear change and people always assume things will stay static, where in fact every single neighborhood undergoes changes. And I'm very optimistic that this Chinatown will be here for a long, long time because of many unique characteristics. Fundamentally, there are a lot of things that are totally untouchable. The cemetery across the street from my office, all the pieces that our government has taken that has spoken for. Confucius is owned by government, the Civic Center is owned by government, the schools are owned by government, the parks and things like that. So if you look at analysis why one of the recent articles says, Chinatown is magnificent, at least in its core, in resistance to gentrification, there are reasons. One is obviously the associations. The association has been here over 100 years. Chinatown, because of these traditional association keeping on the tradition, we invite you. That's why Lunar New Year goes on for 3 months, and they protect their own because the creation of these associations are so that when you're the pieces, right? When you're being discriminated against, social injustice, all kinds of unfair practices, these associations protected you. So it is very insular. It has its own hierarchy. It has its own culture. So but you also, if you look at the other patterns of the other ethnic groups, whether Little Italy, Little Ireland, Little Germany, the Klein Deutschland, across the nation and across North America, you will begin to see a pattern that the satellite communities, people vote with their feet. No one points a gun with their head and just say, you must get out of here. It's actually each succeeding group succeeded in pursuing the American dream to improve their lives. Their children get educated like Irene, and they get better themselves. So the question, the reason is a riddle, is because no other, the 17 Chinatown that are in North America, 16 are exactly like mine. Aging with a lot of pharmacies, with fabulous doctors. And as a result, you have to look at it, just say, so what will make this one the exception? And we believe we found some formulas that will make it successful.
So Irene, let's pick up on that point. You're part of the second generation or third generation that Wellington just spoke about. Well, where do you envision Chinatown being in a few years from now?
Well, I'll just start by saying I also believe that a lot of the reason why Chinatown has maintained itself is because of the culture and history of resistance that we've shown as organizers and as people that have fought for their community, for their culture, for their historical.
Notwithstanding that, I agree with that, but it's you're surrounded by some of the wealthiest, richest communities in America, and you managed to really keep it at bay. And how so? Beyond protests, a lot of other groups have protests and not successfully. How have you managed to do that?
Well, one example in the 80s, so the organization that I work with, Chinese Staff and Workers Association, we've been around for about 40 years. And in the 80s, we actually sued the city for a luxury development that was going up, and we won. And that was a landmark case, something like that hadn't been done before, or won for that matter. And I think that set a precedence that, it's not just about protest. There's a lot of different kind of strategies and tactics that are involved, but that there has to also be a will of the people to fight for the things that they believe in terms of, their culture and their history and their lives. And I think one of our strengths is that we organize very closely, and we see as completely part of Chinatown, the Lower East Side and the waterfront area. And a lot of the history of what has happened, particularly in the last 10 years, is a fight, a joint and united front against a lot of the rezoning, the racist rezoning that we've felt has pushed and displaced the community. And I think that united front and coming together with lots of different groups has been a strength of what we've been able to do in that resistance. In addition to the local fights that we have been able to withhold and struggle through, we've also been organizing citywide with a lot of other groups that are facing similar kinds of struggles due to de Blasio's rezoning policies and also the long legacies of displacement that have happened in lots of communities of color across the city, in particular low-income communities, immigrant communities. And again, I believe that it's really a strength of the people and the will of the people coming together, building united fronts, recognizing where we are united rather than divided, and fighting together along side by side. And I think in terms of your generational question, my parents were immigrants, and as a child of immigrants, it's really important for me to see that history preserved, and not just preserved, but continuing. And being able to be part of that development of and growing history, and to add on to that rather than have to start over again in a new community or anything like that. We really believe in wanting to fight for that and being part of that and contributing to that growing culture and history and the uniqueness of all that brings.
Good point.
Yeah.
Stay tuned. We'll have more with our guests right after this. Thanks for staying tuned. We're talking about Chinatown's future with my guests Irene Shen and Wellington Chen. Irene, I wanted to go back to the point you were making earlier regarding the fight with the city. Mm-hmm. And can you talk further about that? And what is this fight all about, and where do you want to take it ultimately?
Sure. Well, historically, I'll take you back to 2008. So that was the Bloomberg administration, and there was a rezoning process in the East Village, which offered protections to that part of the neighborhood. And offered height limits so that buildings exactly couldn't come in and be built, and that ultimately protected much of that neighborhood from the mass displacement, gentrification, that sort of wave pattern. And we, Chinese Staff and Workers Association, along with a number of other groups, including National Mobilization Against Sweatshops, we organized and protested that decision of the Bloomberg administration. And in that process also, some of the parts of our neighborhoods were also upzoned. So some parts of Christie Street, Avenue D, parts of Houston and Pitt Street. All to say that we wanted the same kinds of protections, and so we fought for that. And as a result of that, the Bloomberg administration created a Chinatown working group vehicle. So it's like a city vehicle to try to sort of handle the protests. And around the same time, we decided to actually create our own community-led plan and worked with Hunter School, Urban Planning Department, and Tom and Gotti and his students to help create we called it a people first plan, mm-hmm. really putting people first versus profits first. And in that created an entire community development plan, which really prioritized new development as 100% affordable, that also put height limits on a lot of the areas. Those are some components.
And so where are we today with this fight?
So what we were able to do was get the Chinatown Working Group to accept the plan. And in addition, it was a very Chinatown focused and Chinese focused group originally, and we protested and were able to get a lot of the Latino and African heritage members of the Lower East Side community to be part of that. And so the Chinatown Working Group accepted the plan, and that is what we've been fighting for to have in full passing. Now, the de Blasio administration has said that it's a plan that's too ambitious, and they will not go forward with it. And so they've offered other kinds of what we see as very compromised plans, like just protecting parts of Chinatown as sort of a consolation. And what that means is it divides the waterfront, which is a large percentage of Latino and African heritage community members, as well as Asian community members, and it makes that whole area vulnerable. And there's a visual that I have that has the neighborhood shown with a number of the large developments in process, either the ones in process or that are planning on being built. And you can really see the impact of these mega high-rises on a community and how that will catalyze and accelerate what's already happening in terms of displacement and gentrification.
Okay. Now, Wellington, there are scores of Chinatowns across the country and New York City.
Right.
What role these satellite Chinatowns, if you will, in the city are playing in helping with the transition that inevitably will come?
Great question. Historically, Chinatown and with the Little Italy, with the little Klein Deutschland, a little Ireland, historically has pretty much played the role like New York City, which is that New York City, historically, if it weren't for newcomers, historically would have been losing population. Because people, once they find out, landed here by that beautiful statue in the harbor and want to improve their lives for their children, for their family, they move on in the sense that they spread across the continent. And so therefore, this is very much of a historic trend. What has gotten reversed in the last few years is that as you read the UN, the Global Migration Report, and you just look at the Chinese Lunar New Year migration, is that in the 1950s, 30% of the world lived in urban centers. And when I started as a kid trying to help a community revitalize, we couldn't even give the town away because people were fleeing. Now it's the reverse. Now is that there's a huge urban global migration. Now it's approaching 66%, 70%. And that trend is going to continue because not only is it the percentage greater, the worldwide population is increasing. So the land use has always been about competition for uses, competition for things, and also the process of whether it's the Shanghai Jewish ghetto, whether it's the Newark Chinatown, the Newark Little Italy, the Newark or the Detroit Chinatown or the San Jose Chinatown. Historically, if you read it carefully, there's a pattern.
And what is that pattern?
Yeah, and the Hunter, one of the Hunter authors, Wendy Tan, went around called North American Chinatowns, and she defines a number of them. Some are so-called traditional Chinatowns, such as ours, and then there are so-called historic Chinatown, which is totally gone away, like Detroit Chinatown, like Newark Chinatown, which is older than that. There's another Chinatown in New Jersey that's older. So historically, what has been glaringly missing and misdiagnosed is that there was no succession planning.
Okay.
Everybody came here wanting to do better for their children and for their lives. And once they found out they don't have to deal with the leaky plumbing, they don't have to walk up the stairs, no elevator. The fire escape is basically a fire grill. 2 people died in front of my building across the street. And both corners burned in the last few years, including the ancient order Hibernian, which is the very first home of the Irish. So you can see, if you respect history, which is what we are sharing the same common goal, which is to preserve the neighborhood. We work with Little Italy about the Little Italy preservation and historic district, and that is in place. And so the dialogue continues, and it's not just with the merchants, it's also with the religious leaders. And so there is a common theme, but what I encourage everyone that share the same passion as we do is to look at the data, look at the facts, look at the historic trends, and have less fear. because, I learned in the 80s, and it's the New York Times reporter that after 40 years, says New York is two things. After 40 years of covering New York, constant changes because it's constant improvement. Because if you look at the 5 points from the 1860s, when Charles Dickens, he was appalled at the filth and the things like that, and he called the humans should be down on all four with the pigs. We have always improved. Just because we're poor does not mean that we don't deserve a clean environment and healthy environment, or a clean shirt, right? So the less well-to-do, less fortunate community deserve just as much a clean and healthy environment. And so this is a trend that we see because it actually proves that each group, whether the Germans, the Jews, the Irish, the little Syrians that used to be down in Lower Manhattan, they all succeeded. What no one guarded was the back door, which is right now is actually the other way around. Because of this massive affordable housing that is in our upstairs, it is the merchants that bearing the brunt because they are the only one that's not regulated, that's not rent control and rent stabilized. And so the tenant upstairs are living really way below what the building maintenance costs should be. So that part of it is what we're trying to figure out as a riddle.
Speaking of that, I mean, obviously in the piece that we were in earlier in the show, there were a lot of storefronts closure and stuff like that. So what's driving Chinatown's economy years after the garment industry left?
I think, referring to something that Wellington was saying, just that that the rise in rents in general is causing businesses and landlords to have to figure out what to do. Some are, needing to raise rents and evict tenants to try to keep up with everything. And I think the thing that we're seeing is the impact on people who work there, people who live there, people who go to school there, that people can't afford these things, I think as these trends, if they continue, it will shift how the economy functions in the community. And I think, the idea of creating like a Chinatown-only plan makes it very vulnerable to creating like a tourist trap of just, a tourist Chinatown, which is very much not what we want to have happen. It's, it's the community where people live and build and, they were saying earlier, do business and, grow and thrive. And we definitely don't want it to be some kind of tokenized, Chinatown that's only surviving because of tourism,
Disney Chinatown.
Exactly. We don't want a Disney Chinatown.
So last question, Wellington. What is the vision? What would you like to see 15, 20 years from now?
Yeah. Number one, obviously, that Chinatown is actually very authentic because what most people don't identify Chinatown is, and actually is a diamond in the rough. We're one of the largest medical centers. We have some of the New York Magazine 10 best doctors of the years. We have at least 500 to 600 doctors that you have not heard about. Chinatown is also a giant transportation hub that goes to 69 cities and towns. We are the Starship enterprise that connect to 69 cities and towns. We used to be 233 bus routes with 6 million people coming and going, used to be, since 1997. So all of that. And we have never touted that we want tourism because a tourist by definition is somebody who lives at least 50 miles away. The chance of you coming back again to Chinatown living 50 miles away is not high. We're just looking at existing businesses and looking at their patterns and what they think. And Chinatown, so therefore, in a sense, we're not trying to change its business model because they will evolve over time. Chinatown right now suffers from a little bit of couple symptoms. One is obviously the back of the house need to improve our quality because most people will skip a restaurant that doesn't have an A, and we did workshop to improve to let them know that 80% of the Manhattan restaurants have A's, and so therefore and then also helping them with social media to let people come because things like that. And also, as you said, the time, as Irene said correctly, the sign of the time is that we have to support our local merchants because they are the ones that's subsidizing a lot of things. Because, as the mayor of Chinatown said, there are tenants upstairs paying $150 a month, paying $49 a month. And these associations are definitely not greedy landlords. You have CCBA with 62 associations, you have other, and they're not going to chase out tenants, but they cannot hang on to their building. So the vulnerability is there.
Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll have to wrap the conversation here. Thanks to my guest, Wellington Chen, the Executive Director of the Chinatown Partnership, and Irene Shen of the Chinese Staff and Workers Association. Stay tuned when we come back. How artists are joining the fight to preserve Chinatown's affordability. Finally, from us, the Chinatown Art Brigade, in collaboration with CAV, has been using art as a means of drawing attention to the ongoing displacement in the area. We hear more about the Brigade's efforts in this piece produced by Marissa Holmes.
The Chinatown Art Brigade was formed, I guess, in the fall of 2015. The idea came about from an intern who was interning with CAV at that time. Folks in CAV kind of reached out to the three of us and brought all of us together to start conversations around what a public art project could look like. We decided that we would do a public projection project, and that's sort of how everything began.
We wanted to reach out to tenants. The primary audience was actually reaching out to other tenants so they know that there's a place, a home for them, a political home for them to get involved in fighting for their own tenant rights and housing and against gentrification. And then the secondary audience was gentrifiers and gallerists, letting them know, hey, you have a choice here. You can be on the right side of history or the wrong side. There's no neutral side. And we had some messages targeted to gallerists and to gentrifiers in Chinatown, which is rapidly becoming very hipster with all the bars and galleries and everything. And when you see art galleries coming in, 110 of them now, that used to be bakeries and restaurants owned by small Chinese business owners, it's really sad because people on Bowery or on Grand who open up their commercial galleries are paying as much as $25,000 a month. And obviously, like if you're a bakery, how much do you have to sell to even make that?
Artists and galleries are the Trojan horse for gentrification. This whole notion of place-keeping or creating these cultural communities is really opening the door. I think that if we can get galleries and artists to align themselves with the small businesses that are really being threatened by all this luxury development, then that is an important strategy. It is important for people who are invested in really looking at the community and presenting in a very concrete way how that community can function, and to be able to see it and to be able to understand it. So, you know, I do feel like that's one role that artists can take in this whole fight against, you know, gentrification and displacement.
That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned. Till next time, be independent-minded.